Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our Wednesday webinar series, Lunch with the Birds. My name is Amanda Duran, and I'm the Program Coordinator for the Ohio Bird Conservation Initiative. Before we get started, I wanted to invite all of you to join us for our next webinar, and that will be on winter bird feeding. The presentation will be by Tom Sheely, the owner of Wild Birds Unlimited on Riverside Drive in Columbus, Ohio. And the registration for that will be open on our website at the beginning of next week. So for those of you that have not yet signed up on our mailing list to receive notifications of our upcoming webinars, I invite you to do that as well at obcinet.org, and I will have the link to do that up at the end of the presentation. Just as a reminder, we'll be recording today's webinar, and we also have recorded all of our past webinars that we have been offered through the series, and they're available at our YouTube channel, www.youtube.com/obci1. We have a whole list of past webinars, so if you've missed any of them or you really enjoyed today's presentation and want to see some of our past topics, I invite you to go there. We have everything from nest boxes to warbler ID to owls to preventing window collision, so there is a vast selection of available webinars there. So that brings us to our presentation today. Today's presenter is John Windau. John is a wildlife communications specialist with the Ohio Division of Wildlife, and he works out of the District 2 office in Findlay, Ohio. During his career with the Division of Wildlife, John has also worked in the wildlife management section, stationed mostly at Killdeer Plains Wildlife Area. So with that, I'm going to bring up your presentation and turn it over to you, John.
Well, thank you. Hello and welcome everyone. As Amanda said, my name is John Windau and I am a communications specialist for the Division of Wildlife. And we are the state agency that in Ohio that is tasked with managing wildlife populations here in Ohio. Today we will explore the life of the passenger pigeon, its demise, and hopefully some lessons we can use to prevent any further losses. So with that, let's begin. So today we're going to learn some of the basics about the passenger pigeon. I should note that passenger pigeons have been extinct for 100 years as of last month. And since I'm not nearly that old, the information I'm presenting in this webinar has been gathered from a variety of sources. I will try to cite sources when possible. However, a lot of the information is referenced in multiple documents and writings. So after we learn about the passenger pigeon, we will look into some of the factors that contributed to its demise, the demise of the species. And I will give some additional thoughts that I have that may have also played a role. And finally, we'll try to determine if their story is still relevant. And it's my hope that you agree that it probably most definitely is, and more than most probably didn't realize. So what did they look like? Well, the reports were that the passenger pigeon was very comparable in size to the modern rock dove or domestic pigeon that we see in most of our cities now. The tail was slightly longer. Males were around 16 inches long and weighed in around 12 ounces. Females were somewhat smaller and more pale in color and weighed in around 10 ounces. Although larger than the mourning dove, their color pattern was actually very similar, except the passenger pigeons lacked the black spot on the side of the neck that the mourning doves have, highlighted in the right photo. Males had an upper bluish iridescent slate on their neck. Their breast was wine-colored with a white belly, and females, as in most birds, were more pale and plain in color. Reports indicate that the passenger pigeons were found throughout the entire forested area of eastern North America, as far north as northern Canada and as far south as Cuba and Mexico. There were even reports of birds as far west as Oregon, Nevada, and Wyoming, but their primary range was centered around eastern hardwood forests. Most of the writings from the 1800s focus on the Ohio Valley and the Great Lakes states of Kentucky, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Michigan, Wisconsin, and Minnesota, which at that time was likely their principal breeding area of the passenger pigeon. However, their original range probably extended well into the New England colonies, but they were extirpated from those areas in the late 1600s and early 1700s. So in hindsight, there were definitely some indications of what was about to come. Passenger pigeons likely fed on a variety of seed sources, including grains from the early pioneers' farms, which probably didn't earn them a lot of favor at the time. However, acorns, beech nuts, and other masts were definitely a mainstay of the passenger pigeon and likely defined their primary range. These hardwoods also served as nesting platforms for the pigeons' nests. Reports indicate that female passenger pigeons would lay one egg, which obviously made the eventual recovery efforts difficult. An article from the May 1965 edition of the Conservation Bulletin here in Ohio quoted a Potawatomi chief as stating that the eggs would hatch in 10 days and that both parents shared in rearing the young. Besides their extinction, passenger pigeons were probably best known for the sheer numbers and social behavior. It was this trait that allowed people at the time to exploit these birds, which definitely played a major role in their population decline, but as we'll see in a moment, likely only a contributing factor that sped up the process. Unfortunately, we'll never know for sure how large the passenger pigeon population was at its peak. Billions for sure, perhaps more. Conservation was still in its infancy in the 19th century. During this period, the continent's abundant resources were seen as unlimited and inexhaustible, so most saw no need to worry about conserving. For early conservationists, there were also no standards in estimating or documenting numbers, so we can only take their observations at face value. Still, passenger pigeons were definitely the most numerous bird that we know of in North America. 2.5 centuries before their extinction, passenger pigeons were found in the New England states. During the 1600s, the early colonists reported large flocks that contained millions and millions of birds. According to James Trefethen's book, An American Crusade for Wildlife, one Massachusetts colonist wrote in 1673 of a flock that stretched 4 to 5 miles long and had no beginning or end and was so thick that it blocked out the sun. One family reportedly killed 100 dozen passenger pigeons by batting them from air with poles as the birds migrated through. In 1643, Trefethen reports that one flight of pigeons destroyed so many of the Plymouth's crop fields that the colonists barely survived the winter. By 1672, the massive flights of pigeons in New England were greatly reduced, and most of the birds were reportedly found farther west in the uncivilized Ohio Valley and Great Lakes regions. Fast forward to the 19th century, early conservationists and ornithologists began documenting species they encountered, including passenger pigeons. Alexander Wilson, one of the first American ornithologists, documented a flock in Kentucky in 1806 that he estimated to be a mile wide, 40 miles long, containing 2.2 trillion birds. Wilson went on to calculate how much food the flock would have consumed. Wilson assumed that each bird would require 1/2 pint of acorns a day. If that were true, then the flock would eat nearly 17.4 million bushels of acorns a day. John Audubon, who I'm sure needs no introduction here, recorded an observation of a flight of passenger pigeons he saw on a trip down the Ohio River in 1813. Audubon wrote that the flock was so thick that it blocked out the noonday sun, which is a very similar description to what the early New England colonists had written. Audubon went on to write that the flock passed over him throughout his 55-mile trip, and he estimated that the flock contained 1.1 trillion birds, and that the flight continued over Louisville for 2 more days. Audubon also described a roosting site that was 3 miles wide and 40 miles long. He reports that there were so many birds, the ground below appeared to have been covered with snow. Trees up to 2 feet in diameter were broken off at their bases due to the sheer weight of all the birds. He also wrote of a Wisconsin nesting colony that extended 100 miles with dozens of nests in every tree. Other reports cite similarly large nesting colonies. One site in Petoskey, Michigan, was recorded as 40 miles wide and 10 miles long, containing so many birds and up to 100 nests in a tree that the limbs and even entire trees buckled under the strain. An Ohio native, A.W. Shorger, who did a lot of passenger pigeon research, estimated that one nesting area covered 850 square miles and contained 136 million birds. Other observations reported up to 400 nests in some trees. So regardless of whose estimations or observations you look at, passenger pigeons were definitely an abundant species, unlike anything we see today. Dan Marsh, Education Director at the Cincinnati Zoo and Botanical Gardens, put it in perspective in a recent article in Country Living magazine. Mr. Marsh stated that if you were to add together all of today's robins, starlings, and rock doves, you would only have 21 to 24% of the passenger pigeon population. Probably the most significant characteristic, at least in my mind, that contributed to the passenger pigeon's demise was they were habitat specialists. And perhaps more importantly, they likely required large blocks of forest for nesting. By habitat specialists, I mean they were dependent upon and required one specific habitat, namely the eastern hardwood forest. Passenger pigeons as a species were unable to adapt or use other habitat types or mix of other habitat types. Because of their highly social nature, they also required large blocks of habitat to support their nesting colonies. And, as we will see in a moment, large blocks of forested habitat were disappearing at an alarming rate during this time period. Winter range. I bring this up because as I researched the passenger pigeon, nearly everything I found discussed the passenger pigeons in their nesting range. However, wildlife managers and conservationists now recognize that migratory birds need to be managed not just in their nesting range, but throughout their entire migratory range. So the question in my mind is, were there factors contributing to the passenger pigeon's extinction in the southern part of the range? And how did those factors play into what was happening in the northern breeding range? Knowing the growth and expansion that was occurring throughout the country at that time, I have to believe that there were probably also underlying contributing factors from their winter range as well, perhaps to a lesser degree or perhaps equally at fault. It would probably be interesting to search the writings and journals from that period from authors based in the southern part of the country to look for references of the passenger pigeon and note their observations and interactions with the bird as well. So what caused them to become extinct? Well, namely humans. So Martha, the last passenger pigeon, died on September 1st, 1914, 100 years ago last month, in the Cincinnati Zoo. Simply put, it was us humans and how we were treating the resources and the environment at the time, and to some degree, maybe we still are. But what were the underlying behaviors and actions that led to the bird's extinction? Well, market hunting undoubtedly had a major role in the extinction of the passenger pigeon. In fact, it is considered by many to be the cause of their extinction. However, as I alluded to before, in my opinion, it's probably only sped up the process. First, we need to look at what is market hunting and what it is not. First, it is not the type of hunting we have today, and I can't stress this enough. Hunting today is based on rules and laws. Seasons and bag limits are set based on scientific data and sound wildlife management principles. Often, hunting and trapping serve as the best, and in many cases, the only effective tools to regulate wildlife populations in order to maintain healthy populations. Without these management tools, many populations would suffer periods of extreme population fluctuations, from overabundance to the subsequent crash from diseases or starvation. In reality, there are no longer enough natural predators capable of regulating some populations other than humans. Hunting, fishing, and trapping also pay for nearly all wildlife conservation. And this is true. I see there's a lot of callers from other states, but this is true pretty much throughout North America. But the Division of Wildlife here in Ohio receives no money from the General Revenue Fund, which are sales or income taxes. The licenses and permits hunters, anglers, and trappers are required to pay for nearly all wildlife conservation, and not just the game species. In addition, federal excise taxes on sporting goods like firearms, ammunition, and fishing gear also pay for wildlife conservation. These two sources pay for 95% of wildlife conservation efforts here in Ohio. And again, other states have numbers may vary some, but are probably somewhat similar. So what is market hunting then? In terms, it's unregulated hunting. Market hunters could harvest as many animals as they wanted. There were no rules, no seasons, and no restrictions. They could use whatever method they wanted to take animals. Oftentimes these included large punt guns seen here. Cannons mounted on boats were even used to harvest large numbers of waterfowl. Nets, special cage traps were also heavily used to capture a large number of animals with little effort. These nets and cage traps were especially effective with passenger pigeons. Market hunting, as the name implies, was hunting for money. Supermarkets, as we know them, didn't exist. There weren't any livestock operations to feed the growing populations in cities, or at least sufficient numbers to meet the demand. Remember, resources were seen as unlimited, so market hunters killed wild animals and sold them to the shops in large cities. It was a relatively cheap way to provide food. I say relatively because in the end, the cost was very high. Market hunting had a huge impact on many species throughout the country, nearly eliminating several, like the buffalo, several species of waterfowl, and among many other species throughout the country. On a small scale, market hunting was not much different or more damaging from what had been occurring since the colonists first arrived. However, as the human population continued to grow and the cities began to expand, more and more animals were needed. In addition, several technology advances, primarily transportation, played a significant role in destroying populations. Without an expansive transportation network, there would have been no reason to kill large numbers of animals, including the pigeons. The railroads actually benefited market hunters in two ways. First, as the railroads made their way into these remote areas, the railroad workers needed food, which the market hunters happily provided. Then, as the workers left, the completed railroad system provided a means to efficiently transport hunters and their game back into large cities. The telegraph also played an important part in market hunting, particularly in the case of passenger pigeons. This communication network allowed market hunters to track passenger pigeon migrations, their roosting sites, and the nesting locations unlike ever before. It allowed them to relentlessly pursue the pigeons. No matter where or when the pigeons went, they were tormented. Although many were undoubtedly shot, market hunters took birds by a variety of methods, including falling trees, knocking nests out of the trees with poles, clubbing, and stoning. Special traps or clap nets were designed that could take hundreds of birds at a time. Market hunting during the mid to late 1800s really took a toll on wildlife populations across the nation, and passenger pigeons were probably one of the most impacted. The technology advances to transportation and communication allowed for unprecedented harvest and exploitation. Because of their social nature and large number, passenger pigeons, both the young and the adults, became easy targets. One sporting dealer in Sparta, Wisconsin, sold 16 tons of shot and another 16 tons of powder during a few weeks in 1871. This was equivalent to 600,000 modern shot shells. So what kind of numbers were killed? Sugar reported that in 1882, 75 barrels of pigeons were shipped out of Milwaukee daily to the markets in Chicago, New York, or Boston. Each barrel reportedly carried 528 birds. If accurate, this would equal approximately 1.4 million birds shipped from one city alone. At the peak of the trade, the city of New York would take in 100 barrels of pigeon meat per day. The other large cities like Chicago, St. Louis, and Boston probably imported similar numbers. According to Trefethen's book, people are using nets in Oceana and Grand Traverse counties in Michigan shipped 2 million pounds of squab and 2.4 million older birds to the market in 1 year alone, just from those two counties. By 1850, some early conservationists began to take notice that the number of pigeons was declining. In 1857, an Ohio bill was introduced to protect passenger pigeons, but was met with the words, "The passenger pigeon needs no protection." By the 1870s and the 1880s, the great hunts were a fraction of what they once were. In 1878, in the last great nesting area at Petoskey, Michigan, market hunters reportedly took millions of birds. In subsequent years, there were still some nesting colonies reported, but they paled in comparison to the early nesting colonies. By 1890, seeing even a single pigeon became noteworthy. Habitat loss and destruction. The habitat loss and destruction during the 1850s through the 1900s probably doomed the passenger pigeons to extinction, regardless of market hunting. Forests were being cleared for farms, homes, and settlements at an alarming rate during this time. The American population was experiencing an unprecedented boom, which fueled the need for more resources. Despite the large population increase and the accompanying expansion of cities, the American society was still in the early settler mindset. To put it another way, society's views on how resources should be used were basically a century behind. When Ohio was first settled, most of the state was covered with hardwood forest, except the extreme northwest portion, which contained the Great Black Swamp. This area provided ideal nesting, roosting, and feeding locations for passenger pigeons to thrive. Because of their highly social nature, large blocks of forest were required to support the number of nests. By 1839, most of the forests were being replaced with small farms. This fragmentation of forest may have marked the beginning of the end for the species. By 1857, early conservationists began pushing for protection of some of Ohio's resources. However, forests were still being cleared at a dramatic rate. Despite passing the first non-game protection law, this was the very same year that the passenger pigeons were denied protection in the state. By 1875, the Great Black Swamp was drained, which was likely the last remaining wilderness in the state, and also now boasts some of the state's largest farms. By 1883, Ohio's forests were a fraction of what they once were. Nearly 20 million acres of forest had been cut down and removed. With losses like these, it's easy to see how the passenger pigeons would have had a difficult time surviving even without market hunting. There simply was not enough nesting habitat left in Ohio to support the species. Of course, during this time, other states still had enough remaining forest to support the dwindling population, but that would soon change as well. I've mentioned the term habitat fragmentation a few times. So what exactly is habitat fragmentation, and why should we be concerned about it? Some species are area sensitive, meaning they require a specific size of habitat to meet a particular need. Let's say 100 acres for simplicity. Obviously, in the case of passenger pigeons, we don't know what their requirements were, but a large area was definitely needed to support a nesting colony. And it also appears that passenger pigeons actually required a large nesting colony in order to successfully breed. So what happens when we insert some farms into that 100-acre forest? Well, obviously we no longer have a 100-acre forest. We have 4 smaller forests. Even if they total 100 acres, for many species it is not the same. Some species are able to adapt, and these 4 smaller blocks are sufficient to survive. In essence, they see a complete forest. However, for an area-sensitive species, this is not the case. They see 4 blocks, not the total acreage. For these species, habitat fragmentation is a major hurdle for wildlife managers. Providing large blocks of contiguous habitat is difficult and costly to do. In addition, several blocks of contiguous habitat is required to ensure and manage a sufficient population. 1 or 2 are simply not enough. I should add that it doesn't have to be a farm. It could be a forest in the middle of a grassland. Anything that breaks up one habitat type causes habitat fragmentation. In the mid-1900s, the landscape in Ohio and much of the passenger pigeon's breeding range most likely could not have supported a population of birds. As I mentioned earlier, the birds did migrate during the winter months. It's probably safe to assume that habitat destruction and fragmentation may have also been occurring in the bird's wintering range as well. Regardless of what the final straw was, in 1900, the last known wild pigeon was killed in Pike County, Ohio. Despite efforts to find any existing birds, none were ever found. A few individual birds remained in zoos and private collections. Unfortunately, because of their social breeding requirement, all efforts to maintain the species failed, and the last passenger pigeon, Martha, died in Cincinnati Zoo on September 1st, 1914. So is their story still relevant? The loss of their passenger pigeon was a wake-up call for the American society and really helped spur on the conservation movement during the 1900s. But how far have we come? Could something like this happen again? In other words, are there still things to learn from the loss of the passenger pigeons that make their story relevant? My hope is that you will agree that it definitely is still relevant. According to the State of the Birds 2009 report, there are 67 species of bird which are federally listed as endangered or threatened. That's nearly 8.3% of the total number of bird species found in the United States. In addition, there are another 184 species of concern, which is sort of a watch list. The report indicates that habitat availability and quality are the two pivotal factors determining the fate of these species. Does this sound familiar to anybody? The report looks at species which are habitat specific. Again, these are species which only use one type of habitat. This chart from the report shows how bird populations are doing in the various habitat types in the U.S. As you can see, some populations, like wetland species, have made tremendous strides, largely due to the increase in wetlands. A considerable amount of money and effort has gone into wetland projects, both in the private and public sectors. The federal duck stamp has played a huge role in this rebound, as have other wetland conservation programs. In contrast, grassland species have been on a multi-decade decline from being turned under and farmed. There was an uptick since 2000 resulting from improved grassland conservation language in the Conservation Reserve Program, or the CRP, portion of the Farm Bill. I would caution, though, that since this publication of this graph, a significant amount of acreage has been removed from CRP with the recent crop prices. Here's another chart which shows the number of species, both threatened and endangered, and has been broken down by habitat type. As you can see, grassland birds seem particularly impacted. Grassland birds have declined because of the increase in agriculture, including larger fields with fewer grassing edges. In addition, advances in seed science have allowed for an increase in agriculture in drier regions of the country. So now, areas that were once unfarmable are now being converted from grasslands into farmland. Grassy areas cannot support many birds if they're overgrazed, if they're mowed too frequently, or mowed at the beginning of nesting season, or at the end of the grass growing season. Grasslands and public parks and along roadways are often mowed too frequently and kept too short to provide sufficient bird habitat. However, if they're not mowed, then the managers are bombarded with comments on how unkept and neglected the area looks. This report also suggests that open areas are frequently allowed to revert to forest instead of being managed as grasslands due to ease and simplicity. The grassland bird indicator shows that 40% decline in the past 40 years based on birds that breed exclusively in grasslands. Farm conservation programs provide millions of acres of protected grassland because very little native prairie remains. However, these programs are often in jeopardy due to budget cuts, budget freezes, or lack of competitiveness with fluctuating commodity prices. More disheartening numbers, we've lost more than half of our nation's original wetlands. 98% of our tallgrass prairies are gone, and virtually all virgin forests east of the Rockies are gone. Since our nation was formed, 4 American bird species have become extinct, including the passenger pigeon, once the world's most abundant bird. At least 10 more species are probably extinct. So the answer to the question, the title is yes, it definitely could and very likely has happened again. Maybe a better title would be, will it happen again? And that depends. What are we as a society willing to do to prevent it from occurring again? What can we do to help ensure that we don't lose any more species? Demand change? Well, unfortunately, that's not enough. Demanding change realistically, screaming, protesting, boycotting, whatever, most likely will only help you feel better, but in the long run will probably not do much for the birds. Why? Because demanding that someone else do something that you want them to do is very ineffective, no matter how noble the cause. Instead, you have to make the change yourself. As we just saw, habitat loss and fragmentation are the two most crucial causes of species of concern in our country. So the question to ask yourself is, what have you done to specifically remedy this? It takes a lot of money to purchase large blocks of land and properly manage them for wildlife. Unfortunately, a lot. So who pays for wildlife conservation? As was said before, for the most part, people who hunt, fish, and trap pay for nearly 95% of wildlife conservation, at least in Ohio. Put in a chart, the Division of Wildlife does not, again, we do not receive money from the General Revenue Fund. In other words, we don't receive money from income taxes or general sales taxes. Hunters, anglers, and trappers are required to purchase licenses and permits, which pay for 98% of wildlife conservation here in the state. In addition, there are federal excise taxes on hunting and fishing equipment, which is then redistributed back to the states for wildlife conservation and account for another 25%. Hunters and trappers and anglers have been the backbone for all wildlife conservation measures, and not just game species. Species like the peregrine falcon, bald eagles, and countless others have recovered because of their commitment to improving wildlife in Ohio and across the country. There are other ways to contribute as well. There are a variety of great organizations like the Ohio Bird Conservation Initiative who partner with wildlife conservation agencies. Too many for me to mention all of them here, and I would hate to choose some and not mention others. These organizations are vital partners for the Division of Wildlife and play a crucial role in conservation efforts, which would otherwise be impossible. So the next question is, have you contributed? For some out there, I'm sure the answer is yes. And for those of you, we thank you. And I hope you feel it was an important investment in our future. But for those who haven't, there are numerous ways to contribute. As mentioned earlier, you can contribute to reputable organizations who work with agencies like the Division of Wildlife to improve wildlife and their habitats. You can purchase federal duck stamps, which help support wetlands across the United States. You can also contribute directly to the Division of Wildlife either by licensing, permits, or a legacy stamp, or donating directly. Regardless how or who you contribute to, the important take-home message is to get more people to contribute. Why? Well, people who hunt, fish, and trap can no longer financially support conservation efforts on their own. The number of people who hunt, fish, and trap has been declining for decades, and that decrease in participation has resulted in decreased revenue for agencies across the country. In contrast, the costs for conservation efforts have increased, just like your costs at home have. So the question remains, who will pay for wildlife conservation in the future? If more people are not willing to financially support efforts, then it's very likely more species will be lost. Biologists have much of the information they need to turn most of these populations around. We've seen with proper funding, conservation organizations can make significant strides. Wood ducks, bald eagles, and peregrine falcons, just to name a few. So I would like to end with the listeners to leave with a few questions that I have about passenger pigeons. How could an ecosystem support so many birds that they actually destroy the area they use? With numbers into the billions or perhaps even trillions by some estimates, the demand on the ecosystem would have been enormous. I've already mentioned the reports of trees and roosting and nesting sites buckling from the weight of these birds. We see in some areas where bird populations become so skewed that they actually begin to defoliate and eventually deforest the landscape with their excrement. Cormorant colonies on the Lake Erie Islands being a perfect example. What role were passenger pigeons playing in the environment? Were they helping forest regenerate and start anew, similar to forest fires and windstorms? kind of impact were the passenger pigeons having on other bird populations at the time from competition for nesting area? With reports of birds up to 400 nests in a tree, there probably wasn't much room for other species once the passenger pigeons arrived. I've also already mentioned one observer's calculation for the quantity of acorns that one flock would have consumed. This definitely would have impacted the food supply for other wildlife in the area. Did the passenger pigeon cause other species to move out of the areas or reduce other wildlife populations? Unfortunately, we will probably never know. So these questions lead to one bigger question. Was this all by design or circumstance? In other words, was this part of nature's plan, or was there some catastrophic event which tipped the balance of nature? How long had their population been so dominant? Obviously, reports back to the 1600s seem to show for at least for quite a while. Without human intervention, how long would it have continued? And could it have continued? In the natural world, rarely does one species completely dominate. Generally, species are so interwoven that there's a chaotic balance, if you will, that prevents one species from becoming too abundant that it becomes destructive. It isn't until humans get involved that the interconnected webs begin to get cut. And what if they had survived? What would the modern world be like with flocks of passenger pigeons that would descend on areas like an army? What impact would they have had on our current species? Were they destined to outcompete and eliminate other species? Historically speaking, in evolutionary timescale, that is how some species disappeared. They were replaced by other species that were better adapted. We can never know for sure the answers to these questions, but nonetheless, it is intriguing to think about. And with that, if anyone has any questions, I'd be happy to answer.
Thanks so much, John. Those are some really thought-provoking questions for sure. And I often think about if the passenger pigeon had been able to survive, if even through the 1800s into the 1900s, would they have been able to have a place in our modern society? And I think you discussed that well and mentioned that most likely, even within today's more conservation mindset that we have, I don't know that they would have been able to survive with the lifestyle that they had. So thanks so much for all of those great questions and great insights into the important lessons we can take from the extinction of this species. So again, I invite you all to enter any questions you might have in the chat box. And we have a comment here that you can all see, I think, from Deb Bradley. And the thing I want to point out from Deb's comment is, yes, I think it's important that John made that distinction between market hunting and the gross sort of misuse of our resources versus today's hunting and very close control on the populations of our species. But there's a push to get birders to purchase a legacy stamp. And I agree that that is a great way to have your voice heard. So as a birder myself, we're often faced with the challenge of recognizing that our funds are not those that are primarily being used for conservation in many cases. So the Wildlife Legacy Stamp is a great way for us to continue to provide support to the Division of Wildlife for all the great work they do for diversity conservation, but also to show that we're sort of, you know, putting our money where our mouth is and that we want to support conservation as well. And again, Amy, thank you for noting the tax checkoff program is great as well. And although this doesn't necessarily give a voice specifically for diversity conservation, if you want to just in general support the work that the Division of Wildlife is doing, and I encourage you to do that, purchasing a hunting license can actually be a very effective method to do that. Even if you have no intentions of hunting, the Division of Wildlife is able to gain some federal funds. John, if you want to add any details to that, but essentially it multiplies your donation in a way that provides even more revenue to the Division of Wildlife. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct. When you purchase a hunting license, and say so you put down $19 to purchase a hunting license, we're able to leverage that money and get. I mentioned the federal excise taxes on hunting equipment, sporting goods, and ammunition. We're able to take that money and leverage it, and we get money back based on the number of licenses that we actually sell. So that $19 then is transferred into, a larger amount, say $38, which it's somewhere around there. That may not be the exact number, but yeah, it's we're able to leverage that, and so your contribution is actually brings in more than you actually even donate.
Great. Any other questions? While we're waiting, I just wanted to point out that I thought the correlation you drew between passenger pigeons and cormorants was really interesting. They're sort of a hot topic, as I'm sure you know, being a native species, but they occur in these populations that can be so concentrated that they can actually destroy the nesting habitats that they're using. And you have to wonder if the passenger pigeon was still around, if they would be meeting the same sort of controversy that the cormorants are, simply because of their lifestyle strategy of these communal nesting areas, which results often in the destruction of the habitats that they're using. And just with the fragmentation and reduction of available habitats, that strategy is not as doesn't integrate well into modern society as well as it might have done when we had
Yeah,
larger expanses of habitat.
yeah, and then in the case of cormorants, that it becomes just so habitat destructive, but it also becomes at the cost of other species which
Right.
may not be doing as well either. So, you have a species that's completely dominating, you have other species struggling because of it. So.
Right, and of course we wish there was enough habitat to support all of those, and that's where it comes into, again, supporting conservation programs. And Amy has a question here. Can fishing licenses be leveraged like hunting licenses, like that federal match?
Yes, it is, because there are two actually federal funding sources. There's two acts. One of them is called Pittman-Robertson Act, and that is money that is used for more terrestrial. And then there's a Dingell-Johnson Act, which is a federal act used to leverage for aquatic funds. So, and again, that's money so the fishing licenses would be used to leverage some of those federal funds, the excise taxes on fishing tackle, fishing gear, boats, and that kind of, and boating equipment. So yes, the fishing licenses can be leveraged as well.
And John, would you be able to tell our attendees where they can go to purchase a diversity stamp if they're interested in doing so?
There are a variety of sources. There's a lot of conservation organizations that also sell them for us. But perhaps one of the easiest places for me to direct people is our website at wildohio.gov.
Okay, great. And again, I mentioned earlier in the introduction that there's a possibility to sign up for a listserv, which would a mailing list where you receive a monthly update on our upcoming webinars. So if you're interested in doing that, the website to do that, and I will add it here in the chat box for all of you, is obcinet.org. Okay, do we have any other questions? I have one question, John. Was there any particular resource or book that you found particularly interesting about the passenger pigeons that you'd like to share with our attendees?
There are several books. There are actually a couple noted Ohio authors who had written some rather good books. I don't have their names right in front of me. And then Trefton's book that I mentioned, that actually had a few excerpts on the passenger pigeon, but it was pretty much very interesting because it talks about wildlife and how it was exploited, and then that transformation into conservation, pretty much in the American throughout the history. So less focused on the passenger pigeon specifically, but really insightful onto the American mindset and how kind of conservation, or where we were on the use of resources and how that's changed throughout our country's history.
And one book that I would recommend is Feathered River Across the Sky by Joel Greenberg. I haven't yet been able to read that myself, but I've heard that it's excellent. So I would recommend that. And Amy has an interesting comment here. Imagine the size of trees to be able to support 400 nests. And I often, when I'm walking in the woods, think of how different the woods might have been back in the 1700s and 1800s. And when you hear the accounts of folks like John James Audubon who describe things that are hard for us to even imagine, the passenger pigeon being a great example of that. Try to imagine what it must have been like.
Well, just imagine the floor. I think it was Audubon that mentioned, the ground looked like white, and that was under a roosting site. Imagine what it would have been like under a nesting site.
Right. I don't know if I want to imagine that. Okay, well, thank you again, everyone, for attending. And this webinar is being recorded and will be archived on our YouTube site, as I mentioned earlier today. And again, please join us for our next webinar, which will be on winter bird feeding by Tom Shealy, and that will be on November 19th. So, John, thank you again for joining us today. I really enjoyed your presentation, and I hope everyone else as well. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.